Yeah, so I'm probably more bullish than most people in the Bitcoin space, and I get accused of that a lot. Oh, you're just a hopium dealer, Luke. You just want to get rich. You just want to retire off your Bitcoin tomorrow. You're just trying to get influenced by talking about stupidly bullish numbers. And I hear all of those concerns, and I genuinely just don't agree with them. I am as incredibly bullish as I am, and I feel like I live my life in a way that backs up my opinions online. Because if Bitcoin goes to 5 million or 10 million really quickly, really rapidly, living in a Western country could be incredibly dangerous. We don't know how our governments are going to react to a $5 million Bitcoin or a $10 million Bitcoin. And me personally, I've already made the promise that I won't be living in a Western country when that happens. Because this transition, I believe, is going to happen really quickly and really dangerously. And I've been living on the road for 3 years now. People were shocked. Why don't you go live in Australia, Luke? You know, yes, the lockdowns were bad in 2020, but I mean, your government's nice now. I mean, they're nice again, right? Why don't you go back? And it's like, no, my friend. They've played their hand. They're very clear with their intentions. And when the next crisis happens, there will be a next crisis. They're going to be even more tyrannical. So again, like I think Bitcoin's going to be incredibly bullish. I think it's going to happen incredibly quickly. And I already orient my life behind my beliefs. Okay. I genuinely believe it's going to be dangerous to live in a Western country when this shit shakes down. And just on the topic about influencers and, you know, bullish price, predictions and things like that. I think the best thing you could do if you just wanted to gain clout online was to be a power law maximalist. Again, it's like the plan B stock to flow model all over again. Like he showed very quickly, if you don't care, you just want to get 1 million followers, you just talk about power law, this new model, and just say it's math and science. Don't question the power law. Like, I mean, that's just, and I've been very vocally against a model that's predicting $1 million Bitcoin by 2033 from day one. Okay. I saw the comment that you got earlier today in your channel. I think if we were just talking about bullish numbers, I think we'd both be power law maximalists, but we're not. And I've been hated from day one for hating on the power law. So that's just a little bit on that topic. But how quickly could things happen? So the reason why I've got an accelerated time frame on how I think things are going to shake out is because I believe Bitcoin's a technology. Shocking, right? A lot of people, yes, Bitcoin's a technology. But people don't remember how technologies typically get adopted. They get adopted in S-curves. They get adopted in exponential fashions. So there's a really cool chart that I found about 3 years ago. And I talked about it in the same article I referenced earlier, talking about $64 million Bitcoin. I said, I actually think we could see that by 2031. I know, crazy. Better hear what my reasoning is for that. So if you look at the adoption curves of the internet, the automobile, and the smartphone, you can take an average of those S-curves and you see something really interesting. It took all of those three technologies around 10 years to go from 0% adoption to 10% adoption. And then you hit an inflection point. The technology begins to get network effects. It's beginning to go viral and mainstream. And all of a sudden, after that 10 to 12 years, it's not so foreign. It's not so alien. Most people have kind of seen or experienced this new technology in their life. And then this is when the masses FOMO. We see an inflection point, and then you see around the same amount of time. So it takes that technology 10 years to go from that 10% adoption to 90% adoption. This is how all technologies have been adopted, and it's been my thesis for 3 or 4 years now that I believe Bitcoin will be adopted in a similar fashion. I believe we're living through 2 eras of Bitcoin. I believe era number 1 was from 2008 to 2020. During that era, nobody knew what Bitcoin was. Nobody cared about Bitcoin. There was no need for Bitcoin. And I believe 2020 was that inflection point. All of a sudden, $10 trillion printed globally, authoritarian governments play their hand and locking down their citizens and, you know, there's so many videos in Australia of like police getting masks and like shoving them on the face of their citizens for trying to walk on the beach during the day. It's just crazy, right? People were shocked. People were like, I need freedom. I need sovereignty. And I believe 2020 was the inflection point. So it's my thesis that it took about 12 years for era number 1 for Bitcoin to play out, 2008 to 2020. I believe by 2032, we'll be at the conclusion of era number 2. Now, pinpointing an exact number of where Bitcoin adoption is, it's incredibly difficult. I've tried to run my own numbers because most people say, Luke, but to imply Bitcoin's at an inflection point and to imply that we're going to see 90% adoption by 2032, that means we need to see 10% adoption by 2020. We're nowhere near 10% adoption. And I agree, but it depends upon how you measure it. Okay? If you're measuring it by people who are self-custodying Bitcoin on-chain, I would agree. I would say adoption's 0.1%, less than 1%. There's lots of good data. Blockware did a report in 2022 and they showed 0.37% adoption on-chain. I agree with that. If you measure it by people storing more than half of their net worth on Bitcoin on-chain, it's even lower. Adoption is 0.1%. If you measure it by people who have bought Bitcoin or crypto, shitcoins as well, and they hold it on-chain or on an exchange, I believe we've got about 600 million users around the world today. That puts you at about 8% adoption, which is interesting. Okay, so again, it's difficult to measure where Bitcoin is, but my thesis from day one has been that the masses don't actually matter, because for us to get to that $64 million Bitcoin, what we're looking at is we are looking at a different S-curve. There's going to be multiple S-curves looking at how Bitcoin is being adopted. And when I talk about adoption, most people think about adoption and they think that adoption is hyper-Bitcoinization, all of the normies using Bitcoin to go pay for coffees and groceries. And that's cool, but I think that's the wrong way to measure adoption, okay? Because that doesn't matter. That's not going to impact the price. I believe we're going to see two S-curves. One's going to be a medium of exchange S-curve. So this is going to be how many of my normie friends are using Bitcoin to pay for a coffee and buy their groceries, and how many of my normies earn in Bitcoin and demand to be paid in Bitcoin. That's adoption curve number one, and I believe it's going to be slower. Adoption curve number two is the more interesting one, and this is going to happen much quicker than most people think. This is the monetization adoption curve of Bitcoin. This is the store of value adoption curve of Bitcoin. And this is going to be looking at how much of that $900 trillion of money in the world is being parked in Bitcoin. The people who control the majority of that $900 trillion of wealth, what are they doing with their Bitcoin? That's the more important adoption curve to be looking at. And I believe that is accelerating incredibly quickly. Okay, this adoption curve is not looking at what Uncle Joe or Aunt Jane is doing with her Bitcoin. It's looking at what Larry Fink, Michael Saylor, Bill Miller, Paul Tudor Jones, Stanley Druckenmiller. We're looking at what they're doing with their Bitcoin, because those are the people who matter. It's the sovereign wealth funds. It's the $500 billion Saudi Arabia sovereign wealth fund that's plowing billions of dollars into Bitcoin. Those are the people who matter. It's the nation states. It's the asset managers that control $50 trillion of assets around the world. It's the $15,000 hedge funds that control $5 trillion of money. What's the adoption curve? What's the adoption rate of Bitcoin amongst the $5 trillion hedge fund market? It's 47%. I did a video recently on a report that showed that 47% of hedge funds own Bitcoin. And of the top 25 hedge funds in the world, 16 of them own Bitcoin. What's the adoption rate? 60%. So again, I believe, and again, let's talk more numbers. I love numbers. Of the top 10 sovereign wealth funds around the world, like 7 of them own Bitcoin. And you know that the hardest thing to do is to admit you're wrong and to go from a 0 to 1% allocation. I mention that because a lot of people will say, oh, okay, Luke, that's true. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, all of these multi-$100 billion banks, okay, they own Bitcoin, but they only own a little bit. And my biggest rebuttal to that is that going from 0 to 1% allocation is far more difficult than going from a 1% allocation to a 50% allocation for Bitcoin. Because getting off 0 is the hardest thing to do. Once you get a little bit of Bitcoin exposure and Bitcoin continues to monetize, again, hypothetical assumption, Bitcoin could go to 0. It's a possibility. Nothing's a certainty in life. Bitcoin could fail. Just sidebar, I do think it's more likely that Bitcoin fails and goes to 0 than it just becoming digital gold and just being worth 500K a coin and $1 million a coin, like many people think it's going to be. But anyway, once Bitcoin does continue to monetize, hypothetically, those people who have a 1% allocation to Bitcoin, they're going to increase their allocation to Bitcoin. Okay, so I think these are the people we need to be watching. 6 out of the 10 largest sovereign wealth funds own Bitcoin. That's a 60% adoption rate. Over 60% of the 47% of the 15,000 hedge funds own Bitcoin. 47% adoption rate in a $5 trillion market. Okay, these are the markets we need to be watching. These are the people who matter, and these are the people who are going to send Bitcoin to tens of millions of dollars a coin much quicker than most people think.
So stacking sats is so important now, and just DCA and getting in, like you said, your education grows as you continually learn. But at some point, just keep running away from people, and if it's not your thing, then hey, so be it. But I would love for you to kind of touch on that a little bit, of just how important it is to start DCAing, start getting in now, because this will, once it starts running, all of a sudden at some point when it hits 1 million or whatever, you're going to have people just rushing in, and a lot of that opportunity is kind of gone.
If you want the answer to that question right there, and you like that spicy clip, check it out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. But if you want the full interview in its entirety, all the spicy clips put together, and you're not going to want to miss it, believe me, then check that out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. Do it.